1964, 77% of Americans trusted the federal government to do what is right all or most of the time. By 2019, only 17% of Americans felt this way. This strikes me as oddly bipartisan. In the ELCA's social message on government and civic engagement in the United States, Discipleship in a Democracy, which was adopted in June of 2020, the message notes that Americans feel the government is distant and oppressive, increasingly controlled by a small minority of elites, and unjust in who benefits and who pays. In our civic conversations, some endorse the government and its policies to the point of idolatry, while others reject out of hand the good that government can provide. Lutherans believe that civic government is in fact a gift from God, called to protect and coordinate the well-being of individuals, communities, and creation. And we too are called not to abdicate responsibility of our neighbors, communities, and creation's well-being, but to call on the government to function well for the sake of our neighbor, community, and creation. Now, Samuel had more than a few concerns with the people's request for a king, which is kind of ironic because the people had more than a few concerns about the so-called legacy that Samuel was building by installing his corrupt sons as judges over Israel. Eli had already tried this, keeping it in the family succession plan, and it didn't work out at all. And yet, Samuel is concerned that the people are rejecting him. It says in the part that we omitted that Samuel's sons had turned aside after gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. But the Israelites were not interested in whatever fix Samuel might propose to the problem, or even having Samuel as a judge anymore. They wanted a king. Of course, the people forget that the king's sons are princes, and their concern about corrupt heirs is going to continue and likely grow worse in the new form of government that they were proposing. But that doesn't seem to matter here. But God corrects Samuel and says that it's not that the people are rejecting Samuel, it's that they're rejecting God. And it's easy to say, like, okay, so you rejected the judge, and when there are judges, then God is king, and so the people are rejecting God as king. It's not quite it. When Moses gave his final instruction to the Hebrew people when they were on the doorstep of the promised land, Moses said, "When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set over you a king whom the Lord your God will choose." But the king that Moses has in mind is warned against acquiring horses or wives, signs of military might or economic prowess. Instead, Moses says that the king should be one who meditates regularly on Torah, on God's law, so that he can rule with justice, mercy, and equity, always watching out for the needs of neighbor, community, and creation. Moses knew that it is the kind of king which establishes the kind of kingdom. And Moses wanted for the people, and wanted the people to desire for themselves, a kingdom defined by fidelity to God and God's law. So he urged them to look for the one who would not turn aside from the commandments, nor exalt himself above the people. The trouble is, the rejection of God comes because the people aren't asking for a monarch to rule over them as Moses described. They want to instate a king with a mandate for war. That's the heart of the rejection of God. You see, Israel is currently at peace with the people around them, but the people want a king, and this is what it says right after what we finish. The people want a king to go before us and fight our battles. So they're finally ready to define themselves as a nation, and the people ask for a king who will define or enlarge their territory by going to war. Journalist, activist, and Presbyterian pastor Chris Hedges wrote, "War is a force that gives us meaning." That's what's at play here. Israel has decided that war will define itself as a kingdom and borders and battles, and not their relationship with God, and not their faithfulness to God's law, and not their faith lived out in care for the neighbor. The system of judges brought the people low in the eyes of the nations at their borders. Humiliation has put the people in a fearful state of constant vigilance from which they hope a king will free them. But just as they turned a blind eye to the problems of succession, they delude themselves about the kind of kingdom that would result when the monarch becomes hungry for battle. How they would inevitably become a nation of xenophobes, afraid of their neighbors, rather than a people called by God to radical neighbor love that extends to the foreigner, widow, and orphan who gleans from the edges of their fields. So what about us, beloved? What instructions have we, one way or another, given to our own government? In the end, this is a story about vocation, our vocation, and the vocation of government. Martin Luther always maintained that vocation was much more than one's occupation. It was the whole constellation of ourselves, our relationships, our backgrounds, and our circumstances. And more, vocation is a response to the call of God, which is always lived out in careful attention to the needs of our neighbor. In this story, both the vocation of Israel and the vocation of the potential king are out of focus. God did not call Israel to be a nation of warmongers, nor did God call Israel to be afraid of her neighbors, putting up a wall against her needs. God called Israel and blessed her so that she might be a blessing to the nations, to the whole world. We miss the calling of God if we focus only on our fears and desires and not our neighbors with the greatest need. And then we miss the opportunity to be blessed, to be a blessing. This is also the story about the specific vocation of citizenship. Luther held that the government was a way that God influences the world. And as such, for Lutherans, the key citizenship question, the question that we should hold before us when we find ourselves at our polling places and when we engage with our elected officials is the neighbor being served? This question resists those who would tell us that we should be afraid of our neighbors or insist that the government exists to fill our needs alone. It certainly challenges the conversation that affirms the rights of some when they're allowed to transgress on the lives and livelihoods of others. Instead, it turns us in love toward our neighbor. It turns us toward the place where we might yet bear witness in real and concrete ways to the work that God is doing to redeem and renew us and our world and is revealed in our neighbor.